The two Russians walked past the woodpile twice. The polar night was 3 weeks old. They did not see the cabin. They did not see the man standing inside the cabin with his hand resting on the back of a Belgian Malinois, both of them as still as the spruce behind the woodpile. The dog did not bark. The man did not breathe through his nose, because his breath would have plumed against the cold pane of the slit and shown, even in that dark, a place where something living was looking out at them. The Russians were 5 paces from his door. Their headlamps were red, which meant they had thought about this. Their boots were thick felt, which meant they had walked far. The taller one stopped. He turned his face up the slope, and for a long moment he looked exactly at the line of split spruce that to him was a woodpile, and to the seal inside was the south wall of his living room. The Malinois leaned a fraction of an inch into the seal's palm. That fraction was 16 seconds. Then the Russian turned away. Names changed. Location composite. Yukon, north of the Dempster, give or take. The man I'm going to call Karl Tarpinian was retired SEAL Team 8, 1989 through 2009, a senior chief who ran a platoon out of Little Creek and then ran another out of Coronado, and then, the last 4 years, ran instructors at BUD/S because his knees were finished. The dog I'm going to call Kira was a Belgian Malinois, 6 years old, originally trained out of the Lackland Multi-Purpose Canine Pipeline, retired honorably for a hip that hadn't fully settled after a tandem parachute drop in a training exercise nobody on this channel needs the details of. The cabin he built himself between June of 1 year and October of the next, on a south-facing slope about an hour off a road that I will not name because the people who still live up there do not want company. The road is real. The cabin is real. The 2 men with the red lamps were real, and they did not know they had walked past it. That is the whole story, mostly, and it took me a long time to understand why it matters. I have walked that country in the 80s. I have built things I am not going to describe in detail because I am old enough now to know what a description does. But I will tell you what Karl did and why it worked, and what the dog did, because that is fair to both of them. Karl was 56 years old that winter. He had come north because the divorce was 3 years old and the second knee had finished a year before that, and there were 2 things he could do with what was left of his life. He could go to Florida, like the other senior chiefs, and have his pension paid out into a marina slip and a small apartment. Or he could come here. Per team's doctrine, and this is my joke, not the doctrine, a senior chief plans for what he cannot tolerate, not what he wants. Karl could not tolerate Florida. So, the cabin sits inside a stand of mature white spruce that has been there since the Yukon territorial map was drawn. The slope falls south by about 15 degrees. The prevailing wind in winter comes off the Ogilvies to the northwest. Karl took 6 weeks just walking the ground before he put a shovel in. He walked it in May, when the snow was still on. He walked it in June, when the mosquitoes were a continuous noise. He walked it the 3rd time in August, when the leaves of the alder were beginning to turn. By August, he had marked 7 possible sites with cairns of 3 stones each, and he had narrowed those 7 down to 2, and one of those 2 was a little lower on the slope and a little harder for him to dig because of a stratum of granular till about 3 feet down. He chose the harder one. He chose the harder one because, and I am paraphrasing him here, because he did not waste words explaining things. The harder one was 3 feet lower on the slope, and 3 feet lower meant his stovepipe could exit through the root crown of an old broken-topped spruce that had taken a lightning strike about 40 years before. The stovepipe would not appear above the canopy. Carl did not say, "low observable signature." He did not need to say it. He had spent 20 years getting paid not to say it. That is the first thing about this story that I want you to hold in your hand. Carl did not build a hidden cabin. He built a cabin that was not visible. The two are very different things, and the difference is what kept him alive that February. A hidden cabin can be found. A cabin that is not visible cannot be looked for, because nothing in the visual field tells the looker there is a cabin to look for. The eye slides past it. The mind discards it. The map in the looker's head does not put anything there. This is doctrine, by the way, and it is older than the teams and older than the United States. The Germans, who really were the masters of this in the 1940s, had a phrase for it that I will not pretend to remember exactly. It came down through the teams in the 70s through one particular senior instructor at Coronado, whose name I am not going to give, but whose grandfather was in the Wehrmacht and had built precisely these kinds of positions in the woods above the West Wall in 1944. I am telling you that because Carl, as it happens, had a German grandfather who did similar work in the Carpathians the same year, on the other side of the same war. There is no romance in that. It is simply a fact about how knowledge moved through families and through services, and Carl carried both inheritances at once without ever, that I heard, making a thing of it. I should say a word about Kira before we go further, because she is the second half of everything that happens in this story, and if you mistake her for a pet, you will lose the thread. The Belgian Malinois, for those of you who only know shepherds from movies, is a smaller-framed working dog than the German variety, redder in the coat, leaner, faster, harder to live with if you are not the right person, and almost impossible to live with if she is not the right dog. The teams have used Malinois more than they use shepherds now, for reasons that come down to the dog's recovery time after a hard run and her tolerance for being thrown out of aircraft. And I will leave it at that, because there are people who can speak to the specifics better than I can. Kira had been retired out of Lackland because of a hip that had been struck during a training drop, struck in a way that the orthopedic veterinarians thought she would compensate for with time. But the operational tempo of an active canine program could not wait for. They had not put her down because she was, frankly, a good dog who deserved a chance to age into someone's life. Carl was that someone. He had filled out the paperwork after his second tour back at BUD/S. By the time she came to him, she walked normally. She ran when she chose to. She did not choose to often. She was, as far as I could tell, a dog who had decided a long time ago that movement was a resource, and you spent it carefully. The first night in the cabin, end of the first winter, this is the night I want to tell you about now, because it sets the bar for everything that comes later. It was the second week of November. Carl had finished the masonry of the stove the previous June and had let the chimney mass cure all summer and had moved his last propane lamp out of the half-built shelter and into the cabin in the third week of October. He had been sleeping in the cabin since then, but the first hard cold had not come, and a man does not know what a cabin will do until the first hard cold comes. On the night I am thinking of, it came. He banked the stove at 9 in the evening. The thermometer, hung on a nail just inside the door, read 68 Fahrenheit. The thermometer hung on the outside of the door, where I had a hand in nailing it during my one visit the following spring, read -31. There was no wind. The polar night had started 10 days before, although that far south of the circle there was still a band of civil twilight around noon for another month yet. The sky was the dark indigo of low sun at the horizon you cannot see. The spruce stood absolutely still. Carl went outside one last time before sleeping, with Kira at his left thigh, because he had a habit from the teams of walking his perimeter once before he closed up, and he had not yet broken that habit. He stood in his own yard. He looked at his own woodpile, and what he saw was a woodpile. He stood there for a long time. He had built it. He knew every split log in it. He knew that the south face was not actually split spruce, but was a frame of doubled rough-cut planks holding the heat of the stove inside the cabin against the cold of the yard. He knew that the entrance to his living quarters was a door that swung inward off of cast iron hinges set 6.5 feet behind that south face, accessed through a short tunnel that ran on a slight downgrade so that warm air would tend to stay inside. He knew, in other words, what he had built. And yet, standing in front of it on that -31 night, with the Malinois at his thigh and his own breath plumed white in the still air, he could not see it. He saw a woodpile. He saw behind the woodpile the trunks of mature spruce. He saw behind the spruce the slope rising away to the north. He saw a place where a thoughtful man might cut and stack a winter's wood and then walk back to his cabin, wherever the cabin was, which was somewhere else, not here. That was the moment he knew the project had worked. Per team's doctrine, as I said. The man who built the position has to be able to lose it himself when he steps outside it. If you can still see your own work, your enemy will see it before you do. He walked back inside through the false stack. He pulled the door shut behind him. He pegged the latch. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and the kerosene of the lamp on the table and the faint, clean odor of Kira, which was the smell of a clean, working dog and not of a pet, if that distinction means anything to you. Kira went to the rug in front of the stove and turned 3 times and lay down. Carl sat at the table and made one entry in a logbook he kept in the careful schoolhouse hand of a man who had filled out perhaps 50,000 operational forms in his life and still did not begrudge the labor of writing things down. Outside temperature, he wrote, -31. Inside, 68. Stove banked. Wind, none. He hesitated for a moment and added a single additional line in plain English, in case anyone ever read this book after he was gone. The work is right. The dog is fine. I do not feel alone. If you find yourself drawn to stories about quiet competence, to men and dogs who do their work without speeches, and to the kind of forgotten knowledge that beats modern comfort on the worst night of the year, please take a moment to subscribe. There are more accounts like this one. Your subscription keeps them coming and means more to a small channel than I have words for. I want to back up now and tell you who Carl was before the cabin, because the cabin makes no sense without it, and you cannot understand what happened in February of his 3rd winter up there without understanding what he had brought with him into the Yukon. Carl Tarpinian was born in 1956 in a small steel town in Pennsylvania to a father who worked the open hearth furnaces and a mother who had immigrated as a small child from a village in what is now eastern Slovakia. His paternal grandfather was the German I mentioned earlier, a man who had fought, briefly and reluctantly, and with a great deal of subsequent shame, in a Gebirgsjäger unit in the Carpathians in late 1944, and who had spent 22 months in a Soviet labor camp afterward, and who had emigrated to Pittsburgh in 1951, and who had taught his American grandson, quietly, in a backyard, without making a thing of it, because that was how he had been taught himself, how to read a tree line, how to place a hide so that the morning sun did not catch the lens of an optic, how to break up a silhouette with 2 crossed branches that looked exactly like the wind had put them there. Carl was 9 when his grandfather started showing him these things. He was 11 when his grandfather died, in the spring of 1967, of acquired pneumonia after a hard winter in a small frame house in Homestead. I am telling you this because the work in the Yukon was not original. Carl was not, as I tried to make clear earlier, an innovator. He was a man who had inherited, through his grandfather, and then through 20 years in the teams, and then through one particular senior instructor at Coronado, a body of practical knowledge about how a small structure can be made not to exist in the visual field of a hostile observer. He spent that inheritance on a cabin. That is the whole of his second career, and he did it well, and the cabin held. That is the whole story I am trying to tell. But you have to know where the knowledge came from, because in any field of work, masonry, fly fishing, K9 handling, sniper work, electrical engineering, the man who does the work well almost never invented the technique. He is the man at the end of a long chain who paid attention to what was handed him. Carl paid attention. That is the praise I want to give him, and it is the only praise I think he would have accepted. He joined the Navy in 1974 at the age of 18. On the same week, he graduated from high school. And he went into the regular fleet for the first 2 years, because the recruiter for whom he had asked about the SEAL teams had been told to slow the youngsters down and not put them straight into Bud/S out of high school. Carl spent 18 months on a destroyer in the Mediterranean, learning, among other things, that he did not enjoy being on a destroyer. He put in his package for Bud/S in 1976 and was accepted into Class 92, which is the kind of detail a man like Carl remembers 35 years later, not because of vanity, but because the class numbers are how the teams keep their history. He graduated. He served in Team 2, then Team 4, then, after the teams reorganized in the late 80s, Team 8, where he stayed until 2009. He did the things that the men in those teams did during those years. I am not going to give you the operations and the dates because there is nothing to be gained from it for this story, and because the team's biographers disagree on the dates of some of the things I would have to mention, and because Carl himself, when he sat at my kitchen table the spring after the Russians, told me that the work in the cabin was harder than anything he had done in the teams. He said it without theater. He meant the comparison literally. The cabin had taken him longer, taught him more, and required a clearer head than most of his deployments. He retired in October of 2009. He spent the winter and spring of 2010 in a small apartment in Virginia Beach, finalizing the divorce that he had known was coming for 2 years. He sold the house. He sold the truck. He kept the canoe his second eldest brother had built for him in 1991. He kept his grandfather's small notebook of tree-line drawings in a leather binder he had repaired twice over the years. He kept a Sako .308 that he had bought used in 1981 and that I will say something about later. And he kept Kira's intake paperwork, although he had not yet met the dog by then. He drove west and north through the spring of 2010 with everything else he owned in a 5x8 trailer behind a used Tundra he had bought for cash off a friend in Hampton Roads. He crossed into Canada at Sweetgrass on the 7th of May. He was in the Yukon by the 21st. He picked up Kira from a transitional kennel in Whitehorse the second week of June, on a paper trail I will not get into because I do not entirely understand it myself, although the dog herself, when I met her, was who she was, and that was the important part. The first summer, he did not build the cabin. The first summer, he walked. He had a small wall tent set up about a mile back from the cabin site, on a piece of higher ground that the wind moved across in the long evenings, and he and Kira slept in that tent and walked the country from it for 16 weeks. He learned the drainages. He learned where the moose went in July. He learned where the lynx scat appeared along the creek and where the wolverine sign came down off the ridge. He learned the wind. The wind in that country, in the warm months, comes down the slope in the late morning when the sun loads the upper bench, and it reverses in the late afternoon when the sun moves around and the cold air drains. He learned this not because he wanted to know it for its own sake, but because he wanted to know where exactly a stovepipe at the cabin he intended to build would be smelled by a moving observer, and how often and at what hour. He carried a small notebook for those 16 weeks. The White Horse Co-op had sold him a half-dozen of them on his way out of town. He filled the first 3 completely. The third one I have seen, by the way, because he showed it to me at the kitchen table. It has the same careful schoolhouse hand his grandfather had taught him, and almost every page is a diagram of wind, or sun angle, or the way the ground falls toward water, or twice, a sketch of how a particular shadow lay on the snow when he came back through in October. In late August of that first summer, with the leaves beginning to turn and the air at night beginning to drop into the high 30s, he picked his site. I have already described it. Granular till at 3 feet down, which made the digging harder, but put the floor of the structure into a stable horizon that would not heave through the freeze-thaw. South-facing slope, 15 degrees off horizontal, which would shed water in the spring and would catch what little sun there was in February through April. The broken-topped spruce that had taken the lightning strike was about 14 meters from the future entrance, well within the run of a chimney pipe through the duff, and the broken top of that tree meant that the smoke from the stove would emerge not from a vertical iron stack, which is the most readable feature of any cabin from the air, but from a charred and hollowed tree snag, whose smoke would have to be tracked back to its source from above through a deliberate analysis a casual observer was not going to perform. This is the kind of decision that Carl made about every element of the cabin. It was not paranoia. He did not, at that point, have anyone in particular to be paranoid about. He was simply applying the discipline his grandfather had taught him and his team's instructors had refined to a structure he was going to live in alone with a dog. It was the only way he knew how to build. He broke ground on the 4th of September of his first year up there, with the leaves of the alder already orange. Kira watched. She watched without interfering. She watched as a working dog watches her handler doing patient work, with a calm that the man across the table from me, the spring afterwards, would describe by saying that she had decided he was a competent person, and she was prepared to wait while he did the things that competent people do. He dug for 3 weeks before the ground began to freeze in earnest. He stopped at the first hard frost and laid tarps over the open excavation and a foot of dry birch chips over the tarps to keep the floor from heaving in the winter. He went into White Horse for the dark months. He worked in a hardware store on the back counter for 3 days a week through that winter, drawing the second half of his pension and saving the wage. Kira slept in the cab of the Tundra during his shifts. He went out to her every 2 hours. He was that kind of man. In late April of his second year up there, and you should know that everything I am telling you about now is 2 full years before the Russians walked past his cabin in the polar night, Carl drove back to the site with a truck full of cut spruce, 2 bags of lime mortar, 80 pounds of dry sphagnum moss he had cured on racks in the basement of the White Horse rental, a roll of black iron stovepipe, and a notebook that had grown thicker over the winter. The snow was still on the ground. He took the tarps off the excavation. The floor had held. He looked at it for a long time. Then he and Kira walked the perimeter once. Then he set up the wall tent again and started in. I am going to stop the first part of the story here because the building of the cabin is its own piece of work and deserves its own telling. And because I have been at this table writing for 3 hours now, and Kira is sleeping with her chin on my foot, and I do not want to wake her by getting up to put more wood in the stove just yet. But I will tell you this much, to take you through to the next part. The cabin Carl built that second summer was finished by the second week of October, and he banked the first stove fire on the 11th of that month. And the cabin held through the first hard cold of his second winter without complaint. And in the third winter, the winter the Russians walked past, the cabin had cured another full year, and the south face had silvered to the color of old split spruce in the way that any properly weathered woodpile silvers, and the smoke channel through the broken-topped spruce had laid down enough creosote to draft cleanly even at 30 below, and Carl had spent a second summer adjusting things he had decided on reflection he had not gotten quite right the first time. He had moved the slit. He had changed the angle of the entrance tunnel. He had relocated the supply cache to a smaller hollow about 30 paces uphill, where the wind would not pull at it. And he had begun, for the first time, to allow himself the dangerous feeling that the work was done. It was not done, of course. That is the second thing I want you to hold in your hand. No good work is ever done. The men who build the things that hold are the men who keep coming back to the work for the rest of their lives, adjusting it half an inch at a time, because the country is moving under it the whole while. Carl knew this. He knew it because his grandfather had taught it to him in a backyard in Homestead in 1965, with 2 crossed branches and a length of string. He knew it because the teams had taught it to him on a beach at Coronado in 1977, with a stopwatch and a piece of black tape over his sight. And he knew it because Kira, who was lying on the rug in front of the stove on the night the Russians walked past, lifted her head 16 seconds before he heard anything, and looked toward the south face of the cabin with the particular angled attention of a working dog who has heard a thing she cannot yet name. That was how the Russians arrived. That was how Carl learned that the second summer's adjustment had been right, and the first summer's adjustment had not been quite right, and the work was still moving under him, and the dog could hear it before he could. The thermometer outside the door, by the way, read -38 that night. The thermometer inside the door read 66. The polar night was 3 weeks old. There was no wind. The first of the 2 Russians, the taller one, the older one, the one whose face I will describe properly in the next part of this story, because he is going to walk back through this clearing one more time before he is done, was, at the moment Kira lifted her head, about 240 meters downslope from the cabin and moving up. I am going to leave Kira at the south wall for a few pages. She is patient, she will keep, and walk you back through the second summer. That summer, the one in which Carl actually built the thing the Russians did not see, is the part of this story almost no one ever wants to hear in full. The construction is slow. It is full of decisions about angles and grain and water. It is, in other words, a real piece of work, and real pieces of work do not summarize. But the cabin held in the polar night 3 years later because of what he did in those 4 months. And I owe him and Kira the honesty of that telling. So, the morning of the 5th of May of his second year, the snow was still in patches in the timber, and the air at sunrise was 34 degrees. Carl came up the track in the tundra with the trailer behind him. He stopped at the place where he had marked off the wall tent platform the autumn before. He got out. Kira jumped down. They stood for a while at the edge of the timber and looked downhill toward the place where the cabin would go. There was nothing there. There were 6 small wooden stakes that he had set in the previous September and that had been buried under the snow all winter, and that, by the 5th of May, were beginning to show again. Each stake had a small notch cut at the height the door would be. He had cut those notches with a thin file from a tin of files he kept in the top compartment of the trailer. He stood for a long time at the upper stake. He looked once at Kira. She looked once back at him. He nodded. That was the entire ceremony of beginning, and I am giving it to you whole, because it is the only ceremony Carl had for that work, and he would have been embarrassed to know I was writing this down. He set up the wall tent in 2 hours. He set up the small sheet metal stove inside the wall tent. He put a board across 2 sawhorses outside the tent for a table and laid out the notebook and the pencil and the small folding ruler. He set Kira's bowl on a flat stone 3 steps from the door of the tent and filled it with water from a 5-gallon plastic carboy. The carboy was where most of his potable water for that first week would come from. There was a creek about 400 meters downslope to the east, and he would walk to it twice a day to refill. But on that 5th of May, with the creek still rimed at the edges and the snow not yet entirely off the bank, the carboy was simpler. By noon, he had taken the tarps off the excavation. The floor of the hole, 3 feet down on the granular till, was clean and dry, as he had hoped. The birch chips he had laid in the previous autumn had done their work. He sat on the lip of the hole. He ate a slice of dark bread with a wedge of orange cheese. He drank tea from a thermos he had filled at 4 that morning in Whitehorse. Kira ate a piece of beef heart he had been keeping in the cooler for that day. Then they got to work. The first job was the floor. He had decided the previous winter against a concrete pour. A concrete pour required a mixer, which required water, which required a delivery of either a small mixer truck load, too expensive and too visible, or the laborious bucket mixing of 80 bags of premix at the site, which would have produced a slab he did not actually need. He wanted a floor that was warmer in winter and that would yield slightly if the ground moved. He had decided on a course of heavy spruce planks laid over a bed of 6 inches of dry birch leaves with a layer of tar paper between the leaves and the planks themselves spiked to short, cribbed timbers set on flat granite stones he would carry up from the creek bed. He had carried 63 of those stones over 4 days in the September of his first summer, before the ground froze, so that he would not have to carry them in May. Each stone was about the weight of a sack of dog food, give or take. The cribbing timbers were spruce he had cut and dragged from a windthrow about half a kilometer uphill. They had been seasoning under tarps since June of the first year. By the end of the 5th of May, he had set 40 of the 63 stones in their final positions, leveled with a small mason's level he had bought at the Whitehorse hardware store. He went to bed in the wall tent at 9, with Kira on the rolled tarp at the foot of his cot. He slept 7 hours. He woke at 4. He worked again. He had decided to build the cabin in 3 layers, working from the inside out, which is the opposite of what most amateur builders do. The reason is one of those things you only understand once you have done it badly once. The inner layer is the living space, the part that has to be square and tight and warm. If you build the outer envelope first, as one does when building a conventional house, the inner space is hostage to whatever crookedness happened in the outer work. If you build the inner space first, fitted and squared and finished, the outer envelope only has to be weatherproof. The outer envelope for Carl was the camouflage, which did not have to be square, it had to be irregular. Building outward from the square inner box let him have it both ways. I had not seen a cabin built this way before, and when he explained it to me at the kitchen table the spring after the Russians, I asked him whether he had read it somewhere. He said no. He said his grandfather had once shown him a small ammunition box that the old man had built into a back porch in Homestead in 1962. Square inside, irregular outside, looking from the yard like an old planter half rotted on its frame. Same principle, said Carl, smaller scale. The inner box was finished by the second week of June. It was 12 feet deep, by 10 feet wide, by 7 feet tall on the interior, with the back wall set against the slope of the slope cut, and the front wall, the wall that would face the woodpile, built of doubled 3/4-inch pine boards on a frame of 2x4 spruce, all of it tongue and grooved, and tight enough that a feeler of straw would not pass. The corners were squared with a framing square his grandfather had owned in Homestead. Carl had not been able to bring himself to throw it away in the move out of Virginia Beach, and had set it on the dashboard of the Tundra on the drive north, and had carried it into the cabin under his arm on the day he started the inner walls. The square is in the cabin today, hanging on a peg above the table. He used it for that whole second summer, and for everything since. The stove came up the track on the 13th of June, in pieces. Carl had bought it from a White Horse welder who fabricated small wood stoves to a particular pattern that had been developed in the 1950s by a German immigrant named Reinhold, who had set up shop on the Klondike Highway after the war. The Reinhold pattern stove is a tall masonry and iron box with a long internal smoke channel that runs the exhaust gases through a baffled brick mass before letting them up the flue. The principle is identical to the Norwegian Roycom that the channel's first viewers will, by the way, have seen in another story I told here about a Wisconsin widow named Ingrid Halverson and the sleeping cupboard she built into her chimney. I am not going to pretend that this is a coincidence. The Reinhold pattern stove and the Peismer of Telemark are descendants of the same continental European thermal mass tradition, refined in different valleys, exported to North America in different generations, both built on the same underlying physics. Heat large masses of stones slowly. Let them release their warmth slowly. Do not try to heat large volumes of air. The Reinhold stove came in 11 cast iron pieces, each weighing between 60 and 90 pounds. Carl carried them in from the trailer one by one. Kira followed him on each trip, walked back to the trailer with him on each return, sat down by the next piece while he picked it up, walked behind him to the cabin. By dusk, the stove was sitting on its hearth block in the corner of the inner box. He spent the next 4 days mortaring the brick mass around it. He had bought the bricks, used, salvaged from a torn-down farmhouse south of Whitehorse, at 20 cents each through a man at the Whitehorse Co-op who knew a man who knew a salvage outfit. There were 900 of them. He laid them in lime mortar. He mixed 2 bags at a time in a small steel pan. He laid the smoke channel in 3 passes, each pass tested with a kindling fire and a punk of pine resin to check the draft before the next pass was committed. The draft was good on the first pass. It was good on the second. The third pass, the one that ran the exhaust around the back of the box and up through the broken-topped spruce, drew so cleanly that he stood watching the smoke for 10 minutes and could not quite believe his luck. Then he checked his work 3 times for unsealed seams because he had been taught not to trust good luck on the first try, and he found 2 small gaps and repointed them, and tested again, and the draft was still good. He banked his small test fire. He sat down on the bed of dry birch chips that would soon be under the floor planks. He drank tea. Hera lay against his thigh. The outer envelope went up over the inner box through the second half of June and the first 3 weeks of July. This is the part of the cabin you would see if you were standing in the yard and you had been told there was a cabin, which the Russians had not been. The outer envelope was a frame of debarked spruce poles, the bark stripped because bark holds moisture and rots, set into the ground around the inner box at irregular intervals, never on grid, never quite parallel to the inner box's walls, which would have made the outer envelope appear too disciplined. Carl had marked the locations of the outer poles by walking the perimeter at 3 different times of day in the autumn of his first year, and noting where his own shadow fell in the morning, at noon, and in the late afternoon. He placed the outer poles so that their shadows would mimic the shadows of the surrounding mature spruce. There is a doctrine for this, by the way, which I will not lay out in full because it gets technical, but the short version is that the human eye reads naturalness through irregularity, and most amateur camouflage fails because the amateur builder cannot help making things regular. Carl took the trouble to make every spacing slightly different, every angle slightly different, every pole height slightly different. And the result, by the end of July, was a frame around the inner box that looked from 20 paces like a stand of dead spruce that had been thinned by some long-ago natural process. Between the inner box and the outer frame went the camouflage layer proper. On the south face, the face the Russians would walk past, it was split spruce, stacked exactly as a working woodpile is stacked, with the rounds laid end out, sized between 4 and 7 inches across, no 2 adjacent rounds the same diameter. Carl had cut 12 cords of that wood from the deadfall in the surrounding forest over a period of 7 weeks. He had split each round himself by hand, because the sound of a chainsaw running for that many hours over that small an area would have been heard by anyone within 4 kilometers, and would have written a piece of information into the local map that he did not want there. The maul was an 8-pound council tool he had bought new in Whitehorse, and he wore through 2 helves on it that summer. The split rounds went up the south face in a stack 11 feet wide and 7 feet tall, deep enough, 4 feet, to look exactly as deep as a real woodpile that was being burned through over a year, with the front row of rounds occasionally pulled out and re-stacked at the back, so that the depth would not look static. On the inside of the stack, which is to say, against the actual front wall of the inner box, Carl built a doubled frame of plywood and weatherboard that he could open like a hinged door from inside the cabin. The door swung inward into the entrance tunnel. The entrance tunnel ran on a slight downgrade from the inside of the inner box, under the depth of the woodpile, to a hatch at the back low corner of the pile that emerged at the level of the surrounding duff. The hatch was a square of laminated 3/4 pine, faced on the outside with split rounds glued to its surface, so that when it was shut, you could not tell it from any other set of split rounds in the stack. The hinges were brass. He had buried them 3 inches into the wood of the hatch and the lower frame to keep them from being seen from any angle outside the perimeter. I want to pause now and tell you something that does not, on the face of it, advance the story. You can skip ahead a page if you like. I will not be offended, but it is something that I think about often when I think about Carl, and it is the kind of thing I do not see other channels willing to put into their videos, because it is slow and human and does not move. So, In the third week of July of that second summer, Carl found a tin box under a windthrow about 600 meters uphill from the cabin site. The windthrow was an old one, judging from the rot, 20 years, give or take, and the box was sitting on top of what had been the root crown of a fallen spruce, weathered into the lichen, almost invisible. It was a tobacco tin of the kind that had been sold in Canadian general stores in the 1960s. Carl picked it up. He turned it over in his hand. He sat down on the windthrow and looked at it for a while. Then he opened it. Inside was a folded piece of paper, brittle, and a small photograph, badly faded. The photograph showed two young men in dark wool sweaters standing in front of an aircraft I could not identify from his description, but that Carl thought was a beaver on floats. The photograph was inscribed, on the back, in a hand he could not read. It was in Cyrillic. The folded paper was a list of dates and place names in the same Cyrillic hand. Carl carried the tin back down to the cabin. He set it on the table in the wall tent. He looked at it that evening for a long time. Then he put it on the high shelf at the back of the inner box, against the masonry of the chimney, where he would see it every morning when he banked the stove. He did not know whose tin it was. He did not know how it had gotten under the windthrow. He had walked that ground enough in the previous summer to be fairly sure it had not been there when he started the work. But he had also walked it not so often, and not so closely, that he could be entirely certain. The tin sat on the shelf for the rest of that summer. He did not mention it to anyone, including, eventually, me, until the spring after the Russians. By then he had reason to think about what he had not understood at the time. I'm going to come back to the tin in the next part of this story. For now, it sits on the shelf above the stove, and the work continues. By the end of the third week of July, the south face was finished, and Carl began on the east and west faces of the outer envelope. The east face was simpler. It was the face that pointed into the slope, and so the outer envelope there was a low retaining structure of split log faced with stone, looking from any direction like a small drainage feature built by someone 40 years ago and forgotten. The west face was where the entrance hatch sat. It had to look like nothing at all. He built a low cribbing of weathered spruce, packed the spaces with rotted duff and clumps of caribou lichen he had collected from windthrows over the previous summer, and finished the surface with a layer of moss that he transplanted in flat sheets from a damper part of the slope. He soaked the moss in creek water once a week for the rest of the summer to help it root. By the end of August, the west face was indistinguishable from the surrounding ground. I have walked across it. I do not mean across the location. I mean across the actual surface of the entrance hatch in early May of the spring after the Russians, without realizing what was under my boots, until Carl said, mildly, that the door was here, and I might want to step off it before I broke a hinge. I want to come back now to the night the Russians walked past, because I have left Kira at the south wall for what is now 7 pages of my own writing, and a working dog does not deserve to be left in mid-attention forever. But I will not come all the way back to the polar night yet. I want to come back to a smaller moment first, which is the moment the cabin was finished, on the 11th of October of that second summer. It was a Tuesday. The first hard frost of the autumn had come the previous Wednesday. Carl had spent the 4 days between sealing the last of the moss on the west face, oiling the brass hinges on the entrance hatch, and laying the final course of split rounds on the south face of the woodpile. On the morning of the 11th, he banked the inaugural fire in the stove. The stove drew. The masonry warmed. He sat at the table with a cup of black tea and his grandfather's notebook open in front of him to a page from 1965, the page on which the old man had drawn the ammunition box at the back of the porch in Homestead. Carl had not looked at that page in 20 years. He looked at it that morning for the time it took the tea to cool to drinkable. Kira lay on the rug. The thermometer outside the door read 8 degrees. The thermometer inside the door read 64. He wrote one line in his own notebook, the first in 2 months, because he had been too busy with the work itself to write about it. The work is done. The dog is fine. I do not feel alone. That is the line, by the way, that you saw at the end of the first part of this story, on the first night of the third winter, in the polar night, after the cabin had cured for 1.5 years, and Carl had begun, dangerously, to feel that it was finished. I am going to tell you something now that I did not put into the first part, because I wanted you to feel the line the first time you read it as Carl had felt it the first time he wrote it. He wrote that line, the second time, after Kira lifted her head, and the Russians did not yet exist for him as anything but a faint feeling that someone was downslope and moving up. He wrote it before he had the slightest idea what was happening. He wrote it because it was the line he had written on the day the cabin was finished, and writing it again was a habit that had become a kind of grace. He underlined it the second time. He underlined nothing the first time. I bring this up now because the difference between the two lines, the first one on the day the cabin was finished and the second one on the night the Russians arrived, is the whole interior history of a man who is alone with a working dog in a place his civilian life cannot reach. He had built the cabin to be not visible. He had built his own life by then to be not visible. The two projects had moved in parallel for 2.5 years, and on the night, the polar night was 3 weeks old, and the thermometer outside read -38, both projects were about to be tested by people who did not know they existed. Carl did not know yet either. He had only the dog's lifted head and the long silence of a working Belgian Malinois, who has, per team's doctrine, decided to mark the bearing without yet committing to a posture. I am going to leave him there. 240 meters downslope, the older Russian was moving up. The younger Russian was 40 paces behind, half a step slower, with the strap of a rifle riding the felt of his coat. They were not at that moment looking for a cabin. They were looking for warmth, and neither of them had yet noticed the small, sweet smell of wood smoke that was drifting downhill on the cold air draw of the polar night, because the smoke was emerging through a charred and hollowed tree snag about 30 meters uphill of the south face of the Woodpile, and the smell of wood smoke in that country on that night was the kind of thing you would have to be looking for to find. They were not looking for it. They were trying not to die. The older Russian's name was Vyacheslav Pavlovich Korotkov. I am only going to use it once, here, because Carl did not learn the full name until almost a year later, through a chain of inquiries I am going to abbreviate, and because the man himself is not the point. He was 58 years old that polar night. He had been born in 1954 in a settlement on the Chukchi coast called Lavrentia, which is on the Bering Strait, about 90 kilometers west of where the international date line crosses the Diomede Islands. He had grown up in a state where the sea provided most of the protein and the wind provided most of the weather, and the Soviet Union, when he was a boy, had decided that the indigenous Yupik and Chukchi families along that coast would be Soviet citizens of a particular kind, with a particular set of duties which Vyacheslav's father had completed by being a small craft mechanic for the regional fishing collective in Providenia from 1957 until his death in 1981. Vyacheslav himself had been a small craft mechanic from the age of 19, then a wildlife inspector for for the Chukchi Regional Service from 1989 to 1996. Then, nothing in particular from 1996 to 2004. Then a man who knew how to cross the Bering Strait on a self-propelled sled in the right weeks of the right years, from 2004 onward. There is a community of such men. They are not many. They are very competent. They are not mostly criminals in the way our YouTube audience reflexively thinks of criminals. They are men whose state collapsed under them in the early 90s, and who, by the time the new state had finished forming itself, were too old to learn a new way of working and too young to stop. They crossed to bring in things that are short on one side of the strait and plentiful on the other. They cross to take things back. They do not usually shoot people. They do not, as a rule, want to be seen. And in the polar night of the third winter of Carl's cabin, two of them, having crossed in the second week of January, well east through the Brooks Range and the upper Yukon-Alaska drainages over the better part of a month, were running short on diesel, about 110 kilometers east of where they should have run short, having lost most of a 50-liter can to a slow seam leak on the third day after the divide. The younger man was Roman, 26, a half Yupik from the south side of the Chukchi Peninsula, whose mother had grown up in a village I am not going to name. He was not a mechanic. He was not particularly a poacher. He was a young man who had come east with Vyacheslav because there was no work, and his mother needed an operation that the Russian state had stopped paying for in 2009. And there were people in Anadyr who would buy a certain number of wolverine pelts at a certain price if they came across with the right papers, which Vyacheslav had. He was not, that polar night, looking for anyone's cabin. He was looking for a place to lie down before he stopped being able to. The diesel was a problem. The diesel meant that the small Toyota pattern propane heater they had been running in the lee of the sled at night would fail by the next morning. The diesel meant that the sled itself, which they had built around a small Yanmar marine engine in Providenia the previous summer, would not be able to climb back up over the divide they had crossed 5 days ago. The diesel meant that, unless they found shelter, the 83rd hour was probably the last one in which they would still have a reliable choice about how to die. I am giving you these details because the men who walked past Carl's cabin 3 times that night were not, as the algorithm wants us to write them, faceless adversaries. They were 2 men in serious trouble who had made the long series of decisions a man makes in his life before he finds himself crossing the Bering Strait on a sled with a leaking seam at 58 years old. I think Carl would have wanted me to say that. He did not, as far as I heard, ever say it himself. But he said other things, about the older man's face in particular, in the last days of the polar night, that left me in no doubt about how he had come to think of him. The cabin sat where I described it. The polar night was 3 weeks old. The thermometer outside the door read -38 degrees. There was no wind. The first time Vyacheslav walked past the south face of the cabin, he was 40 paces upslope of where his sled was parked, on a contour line he had been following for half a kilometer because the snow was firmer there. He passed the woodpile at 5 paces. He did not see it. He saw, vaguely, a stack of split spruce that someone had cut 20 or 30 years ago and let weather, the kind of thing a man might find in the deep timber where an old line camp had once stood. He kept walking. Behind him, Roman had stopped about 100 meters downhill and was sitting on a wind throw with his head in his gloved hands. He had not slept in 19 hours. Inside the cabin, Kira was at the south wall, with her head 2 inches below the slit, with her ears forward and the smallest possible amount of vibration running through the muscles of her shoulder. Carl was standing behind her, 3 feet from the slit, with his left hand resting on the muscle just above her hip and his right hand on the table beside the lamp. The lamp was a kerosene model he had bought used in Whitehorse the previous summer, and he had trimmed the wick low at the first sign of Kira's lifted head, because the light through the slit, even at that low wick, was the only signal of the cabin's existence that he could control from inside. Outside, the wood smoke was drifting through the broken-topped spruce 30 meters uphill. Carl could not see the smoke because the night was too dark for that, and the smoke from a well-drafted stove at -38 is almost colorless anyway, dispersing into the still air before it has traveled 20 feet from the snag. But he could imagine it, and he had thought about it for 2 years, and on this night, with a man at 5 paces on the other side of the south wall, the imagining of it was the same thing as feeling cold breath on his neck. The first pass took 11 seconds. Vyacheslav walked past at the steady, conserving pace of a man who has already decided that he is in the kind of trouble that running away from will only deepen. He did not stop. He did not look up. He went on uphill along his contour, and his red headlamp moved away from the south wall and into the trees, and after perhaps 30 seconds, the light disappeared behind the rise. Kira did not move. Carl did not move. They stood there for what Carl, the spring afterward, told me was 4 minutes by his quiet count of his own heartbeats. He did not look at the clock on the wall, because the clock had a faint tick, and at -38 in still air, a man with his ear to a slit can hear what he should not hear. After 4 minutes, he allowed himself one slow exhalation and turned away from the slit and put a piece of split spruce into the stove without making a sound. Kira held position another 2 minutes. Then she came off her ready stance, sat once, looked at him, and went to the rug. He did not write in the logbook for the rest of that hour. He thought. He had not heard a snowmobile. He had not heard, in the 4 minutes after Vyacheslav had passed, the return of footsteps. He had heard, faintly, about 3 minutes after the headlamp had disappeared, what might have been a single voice. A low syllable, in a tone he could not place. A man calling something to another man at a distance of perhaps 100 meters, in a language Carl did not speak. He had not heard a reply. He had heard, after the voice, the squeak of felt on cold snow, but only once, and the squeak had moved away. I want to slow down here for a moment. I want to slow down because this is the kind of moment that most stories about a man and a dog in the wilderness skip past or summarize, and that, in the actual living of it, takes hours. It was not Carl's habit to act on a single piece of information. He had been in the teams for too long to react to the first reading of a situation. The first reading of a situation was often wrong. The first reading was usually the brain's preferred reading, which was the reading that allowed the man to reach a quick conclusion and a quick action. Quick conclusions, in Carl's experience, were what got teams' men killed. The second reading was usually slower. The third reading was the one you trusted. He stood at the table for the better part of an hour. He did not look out the slit. He listened. He noticed that Kira, who had returned to the rug, was not asleep. She was lying down with her head on her paws, but her ears moved, perhaps once a minute, in a slow rotation that he had learned to read over the previous 3 winters. She was tracking something at distance. She was not yet sure what. Then she lifted her head a second time. He looked at the clock. 47 minutes had passed since the first lift. He moved back to the slit. The second pass took 23 seconds. This time, Vyacheslav came past from the opposite direction, downhill along the same contour, because he had walked the upper slope and not found what he had hoped to find, which was either smoke from a cabin chimney or the lights of a trapper's line camp, or, at the lowest acceptable outcome, a small stand of dead spruce that would have been thick enough to break the wind and give them a place to dig in for the night. He had not found any of these things. He was now retracing his steps to consult with Roman. He passed the woodpile again. He passed at 3 paces this time instead of 5, because the contour bowed slightly inward at that point, and he had not noticed on the first pass. At 3 paces, he could have reached out his gloved hand and touched the front row of split rounds. He did not. He looked once, briefly, at the woodpile. He thought, Carl told me later that he would guess, something on the order of, "That pile is older than the trapper who cut it." He went on. The headlamp moved away to the south. Carl heard the squeak of felt boots fade into the timber. This time, Carl stayed at the slit for 9 minutes after Vyacheslav passed. He stayed there because he had begun, over the course of the second pass, to put together a picture of who the man was. And the picture was not the picture he had expected when Kira had first lifted her head an hour before. The man outside was not hunting his cabin. The man outside did not know his cabin existed. The man outside was looking for shelter, and the manner of the looking was professional. The man was reading the ground, not the structures, because in his own mental map of the country, there were no structures here. He was looking in the wrong place. He was looking for a windbreak. The fact that he was looking for a windbreak instead of a building told Carl something about the man's level of exhaustion, his familiarity with the terrain, and the kind of place he had come from. Specifically, it told Carl that the man was a hunter of some long experience, not from this country, and in trouble. I want to tell you what Carl did next, because I think it is the moment in this entire story when his particular kind of grace shows itself, and most of what I love about the man comes through. He went to the high shelf at the back of the inner box and took down the Cyrillic tobacco tin. He opened it. He took out the photograph. He looked at it for a long time under the low light of the trimmed lamp. The 2 young men in the dark wool sweaters, the beaver on floats, the Cyrillic inscription on the back. He turned the photograph in his hand. He compared in his mind the angle of the older man's jawline in the photograph, for it was an older man, perhaps 50 in the photograph, with 1 young man beside him, to the angle of the jawline of the man who had passed the woodpile twice in the previous hour. The light in the photograph was not good. The exposure was not good. The face was not entirely clear. But Carl had spent 35 years training his eye to read faces under bad light, and he was reasonably sure that the older man in the photograph was the man outside. He could not be certain. I want to be honest about that. The man outside had a red headlamp that obscured most of his upper face. The photograph was at least 40 years old. The face of a man at 50 and the face of the same man at 58 are not the same face, and the photograph was older than that, judging from the wool of the sweater. But the angle of the jaw and the set of the cheekbones were close, and the photograph had been found 600 meters uphill from a cabin that the man outside had now walked past twice without seeing. Carl thought about that. He thought about the dates on the folded paper in the tin. He had not been able to read them because they were in Cyrillic, but he had been able to read the numerals, and the numerals had run from 1971 to about 1989, with about 30 entries, 6 or 7 per year in the warm months, evenly spaced. They had stopped abruptly in 1989, Around the time, Karl thought, the older Soviet regional services were being rolled up and rewritten. None of this proved anything. All of it was the kind of pattern that the brain, Karl's brain especially with its training, assembles even when there is nothing there. He knew that. He looked at the photograph one more time. He put it back in the tin. He set the tin on the table next to the lamp, not back on the high shelf, because he wanted to be able to look at it again without making the movement of reaching for the shelf. Then he sat. He thought. He did not move for 19 minutes. Kira watched him. The third pass took 5 seconds. It was, in retrospect, the most dangerous of the 3 passes, because by the third pass, Vyacheslav had returned with Roman, and the two of them came up the slope together, and Vyacheslav had decided that the small stand of timber 40 paces uphill of the woodpile was their best remaining option for a windbreak. They walked past the woodpile, side by side, at 4 paces from the south face. Vyacheslav looked at it as he passed. He looked at it because he had walked past it twice already that night, and on the third pass, the eye of a tired man begins to notice things it has not noticed before. The taller Russian stopped. He turned his face up the slope. He looked, for a long moment, exactly at the line of split spruce that to him was a woodpile, and to the seal inside was the south wall of his living room. The Malinois leaned a fraction of an inch into the seal's palm. That fraction was 16 seconds. Then the Russian turned away. He turned away because in the same instant he had been about to commit to a closer look, Roman had stumbled. Roman had stumbled because he was 19 hours past his last sleep, and his right foot had gone through the crust of a snow-covered windthrow, and his ankle had turned, slightly, not badly. Vyacheslav heard the catch of Roman's breath and the sound of the felt boot against the windthrow, and he turned away from the woodpile and went back down to help the boy. Karl heard all of it through the slit. He heard the boot. He heard the breath. He heard Vyacheslav speak in low Russian, 3 syllables, perhaps 4, in the tone of an older man steadying a younger one without making him feel foolish. He heard the slow walk uphill into the timber, where the two of them stopped about 40 paces away to scrape a small hollow in the lee of 3 close-grown spruce. He heard them building the small fire that Vyacheslav, who knew what he was doing, kept extremely small, more for the warmth of the company of flame than for actual heat, because the actual heat was going to come from the body warmth of 2 men curled close in a snow hollow, with whatever scraps of insulation they had between them and the cold. Karl stood at the slit for an additional 40 minutes. He did not move. Kira, after the first 10 minutes, sat down at his feet. He could feel the warmth of her shoulder against his calf. At the 41st minute, he straightened. He took one slow breath through his nose. He looked at Kira. She looked at him. He nodded once. She did not need any more than that. Now I want to tell you what he did, and I want you to follow it carefully, because the doctrine here matters, and it is, I think, the part of this story that distinguishes the men who came out of the teams from the men who only put on the trident for a year before they washed out and went back to civilian life. Karl did not stay inside the cabin and wait for the night to pass. He could have. He had the cabin, he had the dog, he had 900 pounds of warm masonry and a full wood supply and a stove that drew at minus 38 degrees without complaint. He had a Sacco .308 leaning in the corner that he had not so much as touched in 18 months. The 2 men outside did not know he was there. They were going to sleep in a snow hollow 40 paces uphill of his south wall, and in the morning, if they survived the night, They were going to walk on, and his cabin would remain undiscovered, and the work of 3 years would continue to be what he had built it to be. He could have stayed in. He did not. He picked up the tin from the table. He put it in the inner pocket of his wool shirt against his chest to keep the photograph from cracking in the cold. He put on the parka his second eldest brother had sent him for Christmas of his first year up there, a heavy, older pattern wool parka that I will not describe in detail because the description is not the point. He put on his felt boots. He pulled the toque down over his ears. He stood at the door of the cabin for one slow breath. Kira was at his left thigh. He did not, at this point, know what he was going to say to the older Russian when he found him. He did not know whether the man would be Vyacheslav or whether the resemblance to the photograph was the kind of pattern the tired brain assembles out of nothing. He did not know whether the man, if he was Vyacheslav, would be the kind of man who, finding himself faced in the middle of the polar night by a retired SEAL and a Belgian Malinois at the edge of a cabin he had not known existed, would react with the kind of practical adult silence that the situation required, or whether he would react in some other way that Karl was going to have to deal with in real time. He did not know what Roman would do. He did not know whether Vyacheslav had a rifle in the snow hollow with him, or whether the rifle Roman had been carrying on the strap of his coat was the only weapon between the two of them. He did not know any of this. He went out anyway. He went out because the photograph in the tin had been left at a wind throw about 600 meters uphill of the cabin, and the only person in the world who could have left it there was the man now sleeping 40 paces uphill of the south wall, in a snow hollow that he was going to die in by morning if no one walked over and put him in front of a fire. And Karl, who had spent 2 years building a cabin that no one would find, found that on the night that someone he had not expected had nearly found it without finding it, he was not the kind of man who could let that person die 40 paces uphill of his door. That is the doctrine he had inherited from his grandfather. The grandfather had walked out of a Soviet labor camp in 1947 because, on a particular morning in the spring of that year, a guard who was supposed to have shot him had instead taken him aside and pointed him at a tree line and turned his back. The grandfather had walked through that tree line and had eventually found his way to Pittsburgh. He had taught his grandson, in a backyard in Homestead, in the years before he died, how to read a shadow on the ground and how to break up a silhouette with 2 crossed branches. And he had taught him, one summer evening when Karl was 9 and the cicadas were loud, that the only thing you owed any man you met in the woods was the same thing the guard had owed his grandfather on that morning in 1947. The choice, to live or not. You did not make the choice for him, but you gave it to him. Karl unlatched the door. He stepped out through the entrance tunnel. The Malinois moved at his left thigh in the silent walk she had been trained for in Lackland. No tags, no jingle, no weight on her feet that the cold, packed snow could reflect. They walked up through the timber. He carried no rifle. He carried only the tin against his chest and the small habit of grace that his grandfather had given him in a backyard in 1965, and the dog at his thigh. 40 paces above the south face of the cabin, in a snow hollow scraped between 3 close-grown spruce, Vyacheslav Korotkov was lying on his right side, with his back to a small banked fire, and his arm around the shoulders of a younger half-Yupik named Roman, who was already mostly asleep. Vyacheslav was not asleep. Vyacheslav was watching the dark. He had spent his life watching the dark, by the way, and was the kind of man who, even at the 83rd hour of exhaustion, would notice the moment a Belgian Malinois materialized 6 paces from his fire, with a man behind her holding nothing in his hands but a small tin. He noticed it. He did not move. He looked at the dog. He looked at the man. He looked at the tin. He recognized the tin. Karl, the spring afterwards, said that the moment of recognition on the older Russian's face was the saddest thing he had ever seen on a human face that was not also dying. He held up the tin. He did not speak. Vyacheslav, after a long moment in which the small fire spat once and the dog did not move, slowly lifted his left hand from his nephew's shoulder and held it out, palm up. Karl walked the 6 paces to the fire. He knelt. He put the tin in Vyacheslav's gloved hand. Vyacheslav held it for a long time. Then he looked at Karl. He looked at Kira. He nodded once. He gestured with the smallest possible movement of his chin at Roman, who had begun to shiver in the way young men shiver when their core temperature has dropped below the point at which the body can shiver any more. Karl looked at Roman. He looked at Vyacheslav. He nodded. He pointed down slope toward the woodpile that did not exist, behind which a cabin held 71 degrees of warm air against the -38 of the polar night. Vyacheslav looked at him. Karl pointed again. Vyacheslav, after another long moment in which his eyes moved between the dog and the man and the dark slope, understood. He woke Roman. The two of them came down to the cabin behind Karl and the Malinois. They left the small fire to burn itself out behind them. They did not, that night, speak a word that any of them would later be able to remember. The cabin held all 4 of them. The thermometer inside the door read 67 by the time the door was latched. There is no good way to write what happens after a man has done a thing like that. The drama, such as it is, has already been spent. What remains is the slow, awkward, practical work of fitting 4 bodies into a 12 by 10 cabin built for 1, of getting a half-Yupik 26-year-old back to the temperature a heart can run at without arrhythmia, of letting a 58-year-old former wildlife inspector sit in front of a wood stove for the first time in 6 days and not yet ask him any of the questions you both know are eventually going to have to be asked. I will tell it the way Karl told it to me at the kitchen table the following May. I will leave out the parts he asked me to leave out, which were 3 small things that involved Roman's family, and I will keep the rest as he gave it. The first hour was the slowest. Karl moved with the deliberate economy of a man working in a small space that, until 40 minutes earlier, had been built for 1 person. He set Roman down on the rug in front of the stove. He stripped off the boy's outer parka and his wet inner shirt with the same hand-over-hand efficiency he had once used on a hypothermic teammate in a rubber boat off San Clemente in 1982, and that he had not had occasion to use on anyone since 2003. He wrapped Roman in 2 wool blankets and the spare sleeping bag from the foot of his cot. He propped him so that his back was against the masonry of the chimney, which was warm with the patient warmth of 3 years of curing. He did not put Roman directly in front of the stove. He had been taught, in 1982, and again at the Coronado Refresher in 1996, that a hypothermic body returning to warmth too quickly into the periphery sends the cold blood back to the core and stops the heart. The masonry was the right place. The masonry would warm Roman from his back forward, slowly, over the course of an hour, while his core caught up with his shell. Vyacheslav sat on the wooden chair Karl pulled out from under the table, and Karl set the kettle on the stove without saying anything. He found a 3rd tin mug at the back of the cabinet. He measured 3 spoonfuls of the dark black tea he kept in a tin labelled in his own hand, and he poured the boiling water over it, and he let it steep. He did not look at Vyacheslav while he was making the tea. He had been taught by his grandfather in a backyard in Homestead in 1965 that a man who has just had his life saved by a stranger needs about 20 minutes before he is ready to look that stranger in the face. Karl gave him 20 minutes. He gave the tea. He set out a piece of dark bread and a wedge of orange cheese and a small bowl of dried apple from a jar on the shelf. He cut a small piece of the cheese for Kira and set it on the rug. He did not say anything. Vyacheslav drank the tea. He ate the bread. He looked, twice, at the chimney, behind which Roman was breathing more evenly with each minute. After the 3rd or 4th minute, he reached into the inner pocket of his own coat and took out the tin and set it on the table next to the lamp. Kira lay on the rug between the 2 men. Her head was on her paws. Her ears moved, perhaps once a minute, in the slow rotation that meant she was tracking the wind outside and not the men inside. She had decided, in the way working dogs decide these things, that the men inside were not a problem. I want to pause here and tell you what I think about hospitality, because I have been turning it over in my head for the better part of 15 years since Karl first told me this part of the story. Hospitality, in the country we are talking about, is not a value. It is a piece of doctrine. It is the practical recognition that the man in the snow hollow 40 paces uphill of your door, on the wrong side of the world from his home, and below the temperature at which a heart can run, is a man you are eventually going to be in his place yourself, and that the cabin you built to be invisible is, in the moment a stranger needs it, not the work of your hands, but a piece of property held in trust against the night. The Yupik and the Chukchi have understood this for a long time. The Athabascans have. The Tlingit have. The Norwegians had to be reminded of it every winter, in the high valleys of Telemark, but they remembered it when the reminding came. The settlers of the American frontier mostly forgot it within 2 generations of crossing the Atlantic, although there are pockets of the old understanding still scattered through the country. Karl, by way of his grandfather and a Slovakian mother, and 20 years in the teams and 3 years alone in a cabin in the Yukon, had remembered it. Vyacheslav, who had been raised by his Chukchi mother in Lavrentia before the state moved her household to Providenia in 1961, had never had a chance to forget it. In the second hour, after the tea had done its work and Roman's breath had settled into the rhythm of an exhausted sleep that was no longer the rhythm of a body shutting down, Vyacheslav spoke. He spoke in Russian, slowly, watching Karl's face to see whether any of it was reaching the man across the table. Karl did not speak Russian. He had a handful of phrases from his team days, mostly courtesies and a small set of operational nouns, none of which were relevant to the cabin. He held up one open palm. He shook his head once. He pointed at his own ear. He pointed at his mouth. He shook his head again. The older Russian understood. The older Russian, who had not spoken English in 20 years and had not spoken it well even then, paused and considered, and tried again in his own halting English, which was better than he remembered it being. "Tin," he said. He touched the tin on the table with one gloved finger. "Mine." Karl nodded. He was watching the older man's face. The face of a man at 58 is not the face of the same man at 50, and the photograph had been older than that. But there was no question now, with Vyacheslav sitting on the other side of the table with the kerosene lamp between them, that the man in the photograph and the man across the table were the same man. The set of the eyes was identical. The slight downward set of the left corner of the mouth, which Carl had taken for an artifact of the exposure in the photograph, was a feature of the man's actual face. "Where," said Carl, also slowly, "did you leave it?" Vyacheslav was quiet for a long time. Then he said one word in Russian. Carl was reasonably sure, in retrospect, that the word was the Russian for wind throw, though he could not be certain, and pointed in the direction of the slope above the cabin. He sketched, with the same gloved finger, the rough outline of a fallen tree. 600 meters, he indicated with a slow movement of his hand, uphill, and a small marking-off gesture. "When?" said Carl. Vyacheslav thought. He counted on his fingers. He counted twice, and the count was the same. He held up the count to Carl. 24 years. Carl sat with that for a while. He looked at the tin. He looked at the photograph, which Vyacheslav had taken out and set face up on the table between them. The other young man in the photograph, the one beside the younger version of Vyacheslav, had been, Vyacheslav said in his slow English, supplemented by gesture and by the occasional Russian word that Carl was able to understand from context, his older brother. The brother had been a wildlife inspector for the Chukchi region from 1971 to 1989. The brother had crossed, on the legitimate business of his service, into Alaska on a small number of occasions per warm season during those years, under one of those Cold War-era Soviet-American Arctic cooperation arrangements whose particulars I will not pretend to have at my fingertips. The migratory bird treaty work between the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Soviet equivalent was the warm water version of it. There were others. Carl thought the brother had walked east from Alaska in his own time on those same trips and had stretched the cooperation a little as Soviet inspectors who loved their country sometimes did. The country Carl had built on, by the way, sits not very far from the Alaska-Yukon line. I have not been more specific than that on purpose. I will not invent the paper trail of those trips for you, and Carl could not that night either. The brother had loved this stretch of country. He had been the one who had walked the high wind throws above the future site of Carl's cabin. He had been the one who had left the tin under the wind throw in 1989, on what had been his last trip across before the service was reorganized and the cross-border counts were suspended. The brother had died in 1994 of a heart attack at the age of 53. Vyacheslav had come east in 2004, partly for work and partly to retrace some of his brother's old country, because his brother had loved this country more than any other, and Vyacheslav had wanted, at some point in his own life, to walk in it himself. He had not made it as far as the wind throw on this trip. He had been looking for it. He had remembered the general area from his brother's letters. He had not, before the diesel began to leak, been near it. Carl turned the photograph over. He looked at the Cyrillic inscription on the back. He looked at Vyacheslav. "Read," he said. Vyacheslav read the inscription. He read it slowly, first in Russian, then he translated it into English. The inscription, as best as Carl was ever able to remember it afterwards, said something like, "For Slava, who will walk this country one day after I am gone. Brother to brother, Yukon, 89. There was a silence in the cabin for what Carl said was a long time. Hearer's ears moved, once. The stove made a small sound as a coal shifted. Then Vyacheslav, who was almost crying but did not, Carl thought, want to cry in front of a stranger who had just saved him and the boy, said in his slow English, "I have walked it now. Thank you." Carl, who I have seen cry exactly once in my life, in 1998, at a small graveside in San Diego, did not cry then either. He nodded once. He pushed the tin across the table to Vyacheslav. He said, "Yours." Vyacheslav put the tin in the inner pocket of his coat against his chest. He did not say anything else for the next half hour. Roman slept against the masonry of the chimney. Kira watched the stove. I have walked country in my time, by the way. I have crossed borders in the teams that I am not going to mention. I have sat in cabins like Karl's, in places I am not going to specify, with men who did not speak my language, but who had, by virtue of the cabin and the work and the dog and the kettle on the stove, become for that night the kind of company a man recognizes before any other. I have known shepherds for 20 years, and I will tell you that the dog reads the company before any of the men do, and that if Kira lay on the rug between the two men, with her head on her paws and her ears tracking the wind, the matter was settled. I will leave that there. In the third hour, Karl made up a pallet on the floor for Vyacheslav, with a folded blanket and a spare wool coat, between the table and the stove. He rebanked the stove for the night. He set Kira's bowl on the rug. He climbed up onto his own cot at the back wall of the inner box. He did not, that night, write in the logbook. The logbook for the 11th through the 14th of February of that year has only the daily readings: outside temperature, inside temperature, stove banked, wind, without commentary. Karl did not lie to the logbook. He simply, on those 4 days, did not have anything to add to it that the readings did not already say. The Russians stayed for 3 nights. By the morning of the 4th day, Roman was upright and eating. The diesel problem had been solved. Karl walked down to where the sled was parked, drained the seam leak, gave Vyacheslav 22 liters of his own diesel reserve, which he kept in 2 jerry cans buried under the duff 50 meters uphill of the cabin for the running of a small auxiliary generator he used twice a year, and which left him with the 8 liters he would need to get to Spring if the auxiliary failed in the meantime. On the morning of the 4th day, Vyacheslav and Roman left. They did not, before they left, ask Karl anything about the cabin. They did not ask whose woodpile it was that they had walked past 3 times. They did not ask, although Karl was fairly certain Vyacheslav had figured it out by then, how a man had managed to make a small cabin not exist in the visual field of a wildlife inspector who had spent 35 years training to read the visual field of country. They simply got up at 5 in the morning, in the dark of the polar night that was now 4 weeks old, and Vyacheslav embraced Karl, once, briefly, with the kind of physical brevity that 2 old men of the teams and of the Soviet wildlife services share without further negotiation. And Roman shook his hand and tried, in English he had not used since school, to say a few words about his mother and the operation. Karl nodded and said he understood. Vyacheslav said, "We will not speak of this." Karl said, "No." They went. They walked back down the slope toward the sled. The sled started on the 3rd pull. They went east, the way they had come. Karl did not watch them out. He stood inside the cabin with his hand on Kira's neck, and he listened to the sound of the small Yanmar engine moving away through the trees. And when he could not hear it any more, he sat down at the table and made 1 entry in the logbook. Outside temperature -31, inside 68, stove banked, wind none. The dog is fine. Today, I do not feel alone. He never saw Vyacheslav again. He never, as far as I know, tried to find him. Vyacheslav, for his part, kept his word. The tin sat in the inner pocket of the older man's coat all the way back across the strait, and from there it went, presumably, to Lavrentia or to wherever Vyacheslav was living by then, and from there I do not know. Carl, the spring afterward, told me he had once received a small envelope in his White Horse P.O. box in the autumn of the second year after the polar night, containing nothing but a single sheet of paper with one short line in careful schoolhouse Cyrillic that had taken him a week to translate with the help of a Russian-speaking nurse in the White Horse Health Center. The line had read, "He has walked it now, brother to brother, Chukchi, 92. By which Vyacheslav had meant, Carl thought, his late brother, that the brother had walked the country one final time through Vyacheslav's own crossing, and that the tin had come home. I want to come back to the cabin now and finish properly, because I have been at this writing for a long time, and the daylight outside my own kitchen window is going grey, and Kira, who is of course not the Kira of the story, but a Kira of my own, a much older Malinois than Carl's, who has been sleeping with her chin on my foot for the better part of 4 hours, is beginning to stir against my ankle. I want to come back and tell you a few small things, and then I am going to put down the pencil and go out into the yard, because she is going to want a short walk before sleep. Carl lived in the cabin for another 7 years after the polar night of the Russians. He went into White Horse twice a year for supplies. He worked the back counter at the same hardware store 3 days a week through the dark months. He kept the logbook. He banked the stove. He took down the framing square from its peg every spring and checked it against the inner walls, which had moved, in the way an inner box moves when an outer envelope shifts in 3 years of freeze-thaw, by perhaps 3 millimeters over the 7 years, and which he adjusted each spring with a small mallet and a wedge and a quarter-hour of patient labor. Kira lived 8 more winters with him in that cabin. She died in October of the 8th winter of an old dog's quiet failure of the kidneys in front of the stove on the rug she had occupied for 9 years. Carl buried her under the broken-topped spruce through which his smoke channel ran. He marked the place with a small flat stone that had been on the hearth of the Reinhold pattern wood stove for the entire 9 years, and that had warmed under her shoulder 1,000 times. He left the cabin in the spring after Kira died. He could have stayed. He chose not to. He told me at the kitchen table that the cabin by then had been a partnership of 3, the man, the dog, and the country, and that with the dog gone, the partnership was not 3 anymore, and that he was not going to live there alone with a chimney that knew her shape against it better than it knew his. He moved to a small place outside of White Horse. He took up with a woman about his own age, a retired bush pilot's widow, and they had 11 good years together before he died, at home in February of the 12th year after the polar night of the same quiet pneumonia that had carried his grandfather off in Homestead in 1967. He was 66. The cabin is still there. The widow took me up to it the following May on a small chartered float plane out of a lake near White Horse. We landed. We walked the 400 meters up the slope through New Alder. We came to the south face. I had not been there in many years. I stood in the yard, where the snow was still in patches on the ground, and I looked at the woodpile. I knew exactly what I was looking at because Carl had walked me through the construction at the kitchen table the spring after the Russians, and because I had been up to the cabin 3 times in the years after that. I knew the lightning-struck spruce was uphill on my right, and that the smoke channel ran through it. I knew the entrance hatch on the west side was 3 paces behind a particular bunch of caribou lichen that was greener than the lichens around it, because Carl had soaked it every week through 3 summers. I knew the brass hinges were buried 3 inches into the wood of the hatch. I knew the framing square was hanging on a peg above the table inside. and I stood in the yard, in the cool sun of a Yukon May, with the alder beginning to leaf, and I looked at the woodpile, and what I saw was a woodpile. I could not see the cabin. I knew it was there. I could not see it. I had to walk forward and put my hand on the front row of split rounds before the structure resolved itself in the way a magic eye image resolves once the focal length of the eye finds the right plane. And I saw the entrance tunnel behind the split rounds and the inner box behind the tunnel and the masonry of the chimney behind the box and the high shelf above the chimney where the Cyrillic tin had once sat. I sat down on a windthrow about 10 paces uphill of the cabin. The widow sat down beside me. We did not say anything for a while. Then she said, in the quiet voice of a woman who had loved a man who could build that kind of thing, that he had told her once, in their first year together, that the cabin had been the longest piece of conversation of his life. That every adjustment, every pole, every fitted plank had been a word he had spoken to no one in particular, and that the cabin had been the place where, finally, after 20 years of operations, he could not describe, and a divorce he could not explain, and a daughter, yes, by the way, there had been a daughter briefly in the second marriage, who had died at 5 months of a sleep apnea condition the doctors had not caught in time. And after his grandfather's quiet death, and his own father's quieter one, and the steady wearing down of 40 years in the Navy, the cabin had been the place where he had said the things he could not have said anywhere else. He had said them slowly. He had said them